Hi, welcome to Talking Text. Our passage is 1 Peter chapter 4 from verse 15. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel? And if the righteous are scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. Peter continues to encourage these believers through suffering, but he says don't suffer as a murderer or an evildoer or as a thief or as a meddler. Those who meddle, he lumps them in with murderers and thieves and evildoers. And he says, don't be caught involved with those things and suffering for doing those things, but rather suffer as a Christian. He says, if anyone's suffering as a Christian, he ought not to be ashamed. You don't have to be ashamed of that, but rather bring glory to God through your suffering. And so Peter encourages the believers to bring glory to God even through suffering. And he says, it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will the outcome be for those who do not obey the gospel? Or if the righteous are scarcely saved, what will become of the sinner? Peter just referencing here the gospel, that those who believe the gospel, we are scarcely saved, certainly by nothing we've done. We've only believed in Jesus, and therefore we are saved. We are made right before God. And that's why he's saying, how can the unsaved ever cope with what is coming, not only presently, but also the return of Jesus? And he's saying that's why we ought to begin judgment in the house of God. Those who have the Spirit of God, those who are made right with God, well, surely we ought not to be caught up as evildoers and people caught in meddling or murder. And he says, no, let judgment start in the house of God. Those who have been saved, those who have been redeemed, they have the chance to rejoice in God, to be godly, and to live out a life that glorifies God. He says, but the outcome for those who don't obey the gospel is very desperate indeed. And he says, let not those who suffer according to God's will, or therefore let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to the faithful Creator while doing good. Those who suffer can entrust themselves to God, who is a faithful Creator, the faithful one. And he says, all the while we can still do good. And so he's urging the believers here, even in the midst of great suffering, to pursue good, to continue in good, to not let suffering lead them into evil. I'm amazed at how often suffering can either do one or two things. It can create incredible dependency on God and result in incredible character and godliness, and people who are just, you're amazed by what God's done in them and who they've become. And the other path of suffering leads people to anger and bitterness and actually into evil. And I just want to encourage you, if you have suffered in any way or are suffering, to find your hope in God, to trust in the Creator, and to pursue good, not evil. Thanks for letting the text talk, and be blessed.